with equal amount of respect and efforts. And then finally, after taking into account the drafting, the statement of the chairperson of the drafting committee, the text which has been so adopted by the drafting committee is adopted by the plenary. And then the plenary adopts the whole thing and sends it to the General Assembly. The General Assembly, sitting in the 6th committee, deliberates on all of that. And after deliberating on all of that, decides what to do. There are 2 or 3 ways in which the General Assembly responds. The first is the worst way in which it could respond, where it says, we reject what you've done. It is a very unfortunate outcome because the Commission would be spending 8 years or 10 years or maybe more. The Commission worked on draft articles and state responsibility for 40 years. So we really don't want to be in a position where we come back after so much work and the state say, thank you very much, keep it to yourself. It unfortunately happened once on the topic of most favored nation treatment. When the Commission prepared it, it was rejected by the General Assembly. The second best consequence is where they say, very good, we approve this. And then say, let us have a convention based on this, which happened with the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties. The VCLT is still one of the most coveted, the most respected outcomes of the work of the International Law Commission. And so is the work on the law of the sea. When the Commission prepared the draft articles on the law of the sea, which were the basis of the Geneva Conventions, the 4 Geneva Conventions relating to law of the sea on the high seas, on the territorial sea, and the continental shelf. So there have been some very high moments, and these were manifestations of that success. So whatever the Commission proposes, thereafter states may want to convene a diplomatic conference where everybody gets together, discusses, and then enters into a treaty. Or they would simply approve it and say, this is good enough. At times there's a third consequence, where members are unable to decide, member states of the United Nations are unable to decide what to do. They simply say, we take note of it. Which is almost like when I was learning constitutional law, somebody told me that if you don't want any law to be passed in the parliament, you refer it to the standing committee. So we take note of it doesn't mean we approve it or reject it. But the effect today is that the International Law Commission has gathered so much respect in the international community. Whatever the Commission does, whatever the Commission says is taken with a lot of seriousness. And one ideal example of that is the draft articles on state responsibility. Yes, they took 40 years to be completed. The General Assembly has only noted them. But if you look at international courts and tribunals, in all international courts and tribunals, draft articles of state responsibilities are used regularly. And they are almost treated as binding law. And that comes from the authority that the Commission carries. It is the quality of the work that the Commission does has given its position. There are various criticisms about the pace of the Commission, about the age composition of the Commission. I suppose people will not complain so much about it anymore because there are some very young members in the Commission. The Commission has transformed itself. The kind of topics we address has changed. We also try to address procedural other aspects. We try to think innovatively, although not too much. But I think there has to be a balance of everything. And it does ensure that balance. The final point that I wish to make is that it ensures neutrality. I have always said this. I'm a huge fan of the International Court of Justice, as much as I am of the International Law Commission. Reason being, it neutralizes the cultural preferences. It neutralizes the legal backgrounds. We all come from different backgrounds. The judges of the ICJ, we the members of the International Law Commission, we come from different cultural and legal backgrounds. Our understandings of humanity, our understandings of the world, the way we look at the world, the direction in which we want the world to go are very different. But despite our differences, we are willing to get together, find common ground, and find common ground which is acceptable to all. While doing that, the only way to be convincing is to be neutral. And it is on the basis of the expertise, knowledge, we achieve that neutrality and that success. I hope it has been helpful. I look forward to your question and comments. Thank you.
So, usually what is the success rate of a draft being accepted in the Commission? In the General Assembly?
Oh, I wish somebody could really measure the success rate like people measure it on the cricket field. It's difficult to even put a parameter for that, for success rate. The reason being, for somebody, today let me take the example of draft articles on state responsibility. At the moment there's a discussion going on in the 6th committee between member states whether we should convene a diplomatic conference. There's one group which is saying that we should convene and convert it into a treaty. They think Commission has gone too far. There's another group who thinks that we should not politicize it. If we politicize it, its effect would be reduced. So, if we develop an indice of impact, it would mean that it was maybe not a success nor maybe not a failure. It would be somewhere in between. You might give it half marks. But if we look at it the way in which it is being used by courts and tribunals, it's performing very high. So if we have to have that success rate or strike rate, I really don't know how we'll be able to measure it. But what best we can do is try to look at specific topics and how states have reacted to it. I told you about the failure of most favored nation treatment draft articles. But there's another example of success. The Commission constituted a study group to study MFN. And that study report was submitted to the General Assembly and was praised by them, by member states, by others, and it is now being used as well in international courts and tribunals. So what was a failure on MFN is now a success on MFN. So I really don't think it's possible to do that, and even if we do that, the picture that would emerge may not be the full and the appropriate picture. But what we do within the Commission to be very careful about the impact of our outcome is we have very strict, rather extremely stringent ways of choosing topics. If we have to choose a topic, we all get together in a long-term program of work, deliberate it on days together, on years together for some topics. A topic is never approved without deliberating it for a few years, 2 or 3 years. It is only then that we decide to take the topic on board. And then after taking it on board, then run it through states and then appoint somebody as a special rapporteur. So this process is a very long, drawn and a very intense process. Getting a topic approved in the Commission is itself an intense task. After fulfilling it, that's the success is when the Commission sends that syllabus to the General Assembly and says that we have applied our minds, all our rigors, and we think this is a topic on which we need to work. We can spend next 10 years working on this. I feel very proud to, not for self-praise, but I think we should feel proud as Indians and for having sent a young member on whom some people might have doubts. For the first time in the history of the Commission, I was told by the Secretariat that somebody has got to that stage the fastest. My topic was approved in the first meeting on the first day. And I was gone to the Secretary told me this is the fastest anybody has gotten here, even faster than Ian Brownlee. So we should feel proud about it. It's not my individual success. I think it's a success of the country, that it's a new country, it's a young country which is looking into the future. It is not suffering from the disease of inferiority complex. So we want to move on. Sorry for thrusting my success story into your question, but I thought it was necessary to complete the picture. Yes?
So, given the trend of an increasing trend of isolationism within countries more and more, going forward, in your view, pragmatically speaking, what is the future of organizations like the ILC, like the UN even? Where do you see the effectivity of these organizations going, say, in the next 50 years, given how globalism is being a little bit shirked and people, like the countries are adopting more isolationist tendencies?
Yes, let me give an elaborate answer. I think it's a good idea. It gives me opportunity to speak a little more openly about things and push a few personal things in. See, when this whole debate in the 90s of globalization started, I was probably still very young, but I was always very clear that never be too enthusiastic about anything. Which also means that when I say don't be too optimistic, then I also mean don't be too pessimistic as well. Be balanced. And let me give you an example. I was interacting with a diplomat. And So I've spent 1 year and 8 months in Berlin in the study where everybody every day, oh, Trump in White House, what is going to happen to the world? It's coming to an end. Everything is gone. And I used to quietly listen and not even respond. Because my feeling was confirmed by somebody who was working in the diplomatic services. I asked him, what do you think about him? He's the head of a state. We have to deal with him as he is. So the amount of toxic atmosphere that we've created is just not necessary. There's no point calling someone, oh, you're stupid, you're an idiot, you don't understand things. Do we want to move on or we just want to keep fighting? And this feeling, I think, comes because, and that's what some of my European friends tell me, this feeling comes because you're Indian. Because you're used to so many cultures, you're used to so many languages, you're used to still keeping pace with the situation being balanced. That's our ethos, and that's why we can lead when I say we can lead. So we should not feel too pessimistic. Because let us look at it, what happens to the UN if US steps out? If UN steps out, US would be at the most strategic loss than anybody else in the world. Because China is very happy to take over. They're saying, well, if you want to bring and give it to me, then, well, I don't want it, but thank you very much. It's actually going and putting the baby in the lap of China. If I was ever asked by President Trump, I would say, why would you ever want to give it away to China? So never be too optimistic, never be too pessimistic. Political situations oscillate. Never put too much emphasis on any institution. When the League of Nations was created, all these academics were like, after the First World War, after 1415, they were like, now that the world has changed, no wars, nobody fights with anyone, everybody is peaceful, as if, they're not going to go home and fight with their wives, or not with their husbands. Fighting is going to happen. People are not going to get along with each other. People have differences. We have to be constantly trying to find a balance. It is that ethos which is necessary. And I feel why India really needs to be in the world leadership power is because India can bring that factor in. Tell the world, fine, there's no point getting emotional and getting worked up. So, yes, there would be down moments. There would be slump moments. That doesn't mean things come to an end. And I often come across people, and I find it a bit disturbing when lawyers and law students are, oh, is it really law? It's almost like if you're having a discussion with a philosopher on morals and somebody comes and says, oh, well, but morals are individualistic, isn't it? It's for him or her to decide. So if you say that amongst philosophers, they look at you and smile at you and realize you're stupid. So I would be happy to respond as to why international law is not politics, but it's a big debate, there's no need to, but I'll just give one simple example. If international law was not there, if international law was in a political crisis, you simply could not board an aircraft in India and travel to anywhere because you have to go across the Pakistani airspace. The reason why Pakistan decides not to shoot down your aircraft, how much ever it may want to, if at all it wants to, or if, let's say the person who's sitting on the trigger wants to for some personal grudge. I don't say that they have, but let's assume if somebody has. Or maybe he had a fight at his home with his wife and wants to take it out on somebody. But still he or she can't do it because there's international law. So international law has strength. The other factor is it has its own weaknesses as well, which we need to be aware of. Also, what we can't forget is our situation during 60s and 70s was different. We didn't know how to deal with international law. We always looked at it as a Western construct trying to resist. But times have changed. The world expects us to take the leadership role. Now, we are the ones who have to support international law. We are the ones who have to say why the World Trade Organization is in world interest. Because according to US, it is not. Because now India and China is doing profit, US is not. So they say, oh, shut down the WTO, it's not good for the world. So we need to understand where the interests are, where the interest lies, and then accordingly move and not be too pessimistic about anything. I hope that addresses your question in more than what you expected manner.
With regard to your experience while working for the committee, what is the biggest strength and loopholes?
The biggest?
The biggest strength of the working of the committee as well as the loopholes, or what reforms you will see in coming future to make it more powerful?
Well, my problem is I'm way too optimistic. I think every institution can work at its best if you're smart enough to use it that way. I honestly can't find a drawback with the International Law Commission. People say it's slow. But well, if you want consensus, what do you expect it to do? Or let's say we do some brash laws. How much time does it take to type on a computer and take a printout and say, convince out of 34, 25 friends and say, we have agreed on this. We can finish all international law making in one session. But no, that's not the ethos. It takes time. Yes, I know, it's a tedious process. At times it tests everybody's patience. Fine, let's experience it, go through it. Because if we want to find common ground, it is going to take time. There are simultaneous translation services, interpretation services. People say, why do you need? People don't even listen. Well, there's a culture, there's a tradition. People want to express their views in their language. Why not? So, I honestly, I'm still struggling to find a drawback in it. Although a lot of members find drawbacks after they complete their term to say, oh, we were the best, now it's all. Maybe when I finish my term, I might start saying it. I hope not, but I think it's an institution that works very well. At times, criticism is just a criticism. It can't really make any improvement in the structure. If there is something of that kind, then I think we are open enough to absorb it. Yes, it takes a long time because there are 34 of us. Then by the time your turn comes, there's a different topic. But that's how the system is.
Yes.
So we have to work with it and make it run well. Now the complaint is, I'll tell you, when I was campaigning, the complaint was the commission is too slow. But this year, states were saying, oh, you're going too fast. So when my topic was approved by the commission, they said, why do you want to put 2 more topics? You already have so much work. No, you're too busy to do that. So, yeah, it's a difficult call.
Is there any influence from the permanent members?
Oh no, not at all. It's 34, and we all are sovereign sovereign is the wrong word though, but independent in our sense. If I'm not convinced, I will put up my flag and say, sorry, I'm not convinced, convince me. And somebody tries, I take an unreasonable position, and others feel that, oh, that's an unreasonable position, then they would not go with me. If I'm taking a reasonable position and I am saying, no, this is what my position is and these are my reasons for it, which convinces others, others would stand with me. It doesn't matter which country I am from. It doesn't matter which background I am from, whether I'm P5, I'm X, Y, Z, it just doesn't matter. What matters is what I'm saying. Is it logical enough? And I must say I was deeply humbled because I was a bit worried because I was the youngest ever in the history. I didn't know what's going to happen. People said, oh, challenge, this and that. But it's very satisfying when often, or there have been some occasions when I've said something and then other members would take the floor to say that I endorse Mr. Rajput's view. I think that's what we should do. So they're not worried about your background, your age, your qualification, what you are, X, Y, Z. They test you on what comes out of your mouth. So all these political factors, regional factors have no relevance at all at the Commission.
Apart from functioning, you are the youngest among 6 regions. I want to know what is the procedures to elect for elected the member of ILC.
I think when I was here the last time I spoke extensively on the whole process, election process. Yes, I'm not sure if I should run through the whole thing. But we have to go, we have to campaign, we have to meet member states, convince them, tell them why they should vote for you. So
you got highest vote. Just know what is the process was.
Yes, so
that country diplomatic state is working or not? Because
yes, the whole diplomatic instrument of the country is behind you. It
Yes.
is working. It is campaigning. So I was told if countries have good candidates, they put them out and throw them in public, make them meet as many member states as they can. I met 120 member states in a span of 10 days. I did my second highest number of meetings in a day was 16. My first highest number of meetings in a day was 19. And when I say 19 meetings in a day, it doesn't mean hello, how are you, shake hands and go away. They want to know about your positions on climate change, your position on universal jurisdiction, your position on issues of use of force, your issues on protection of atmosphere, on immunities. So you don't know what the person would be interested in. Sea level rise, climate change. So you have to be alert all the time. And I have to tell you, when the day I did 19 meetings, it almost became like a record-breaking event. So there was an election officer who was responsible for my election. He was young as well. So when I went there, we used to do 4 meetings in a day, 3 meetings in a day. My first meeting, bilateral, it's called a bilateral meeting. My first bilateral meeting was with a Romanian lady. So she was very happy with me. She was so delighted. So she started going around and telling people, oh, this Indian candidate is young, very good, we should go and vote for him. So she started campaigning for it. And so she came for my reception. So reception is where I gave a speech. There were people from different representatives, and then so she was actually going around catching hold of her personal friends from different countries and introducing me, saying, oh, you have to vote for this guy. And that's when she asked me, so how many bilaterals are you doing in a day? I said, 3 or 4. She said, that's it? She just went straight to the election officer, caught hold of him. What is this, young man? You're doing 4 bilaterals? You should be doing at least 10. And the guy lost it from that day. He started arranging 15 meetings. So we used to do 15 meetings a day, as like people come, I would be introduced, my CV would be read out every time, then they would start asking questions, I'll have to respond, you have to be alert all the time. And then he got into this record-breaking business. So we did 16 on one day. He said, no, 16 is not right, we have to break this record. So he arranged 21 meetings on a day. He said, 21 kaisa hai? 2020 ka feel aayega. I was like, all right. So he was having fun at my cost, but so be it. So he arranged 21 meetings, but thankfully 2 people didn't turn up. So we did 19 meetings, and he was like, we couldn't break the 20 mark. But that was also one of the reasons. Our outreach was so much. So I met so many people had interacted with me, they knew who I was, they knew what my background was, they knew what my positions were on different positions, aspects of international law. So all that helped to get, so we were lucky that I got the highest votes, 160. I think, I'm not sure, but that's probably one of the highest that Indian candidates have got. And this candidate who came second is a very dear friend of mine. He used to get highest votes. He got 148. So it was quite a large margin, but yes, we all worked very hard. It was a team effort. Yes?
So can we apply for internships in the commission?
I think there is a way for applying for internships. There's an advertisement which has been circulated. You should get in touch with Mr. Ganesh. But it's tough work, let me tell you. I really don't want to scare the prospects of people joining me, but I work very hard, and it is obvious if I'm working very hard, people around me inevitably have to work hard. So I had this group of 7 researchers when I went. I had 7 assistants, 7 interns. And I just found out that whatever I was demanding was coming in time. It was quite prompt. So I thought, I'm not giving enough work. So one day I took all of them to coffee and I said, are you guys having enough work? They said, of course, sir. I said, no, because I thought, I'm sending you work, it's coming in time, and I thought, they said, no, sir, actually what we do is we take, not all 7 of them, there were 3 guys who just had fun, but there were 3 girls who worked very, very hard, really hard. So they said, what 3 of us do is, we 3 of us take turns to sleep. So on a certain day, one girl sleeps and the other 2 girls work, and then they would rotate. Then on the next day, the other girl would sleep at night and the other 2 girls would research. So that's how they would keep rotating amongst themselves, and then say, no, so please don't give us more work, because then we would even have to sacrifice this rotation sleeping practice. So yes, for those who want to be there, it's all hard work. Life is hard work. I know it's a very unfortunate thing. When I was in practice in India, and I used to often see people used to say, अरे यार कुछ नहीं, किसी के ये हो जाएगा, पहचान से हो जाएगा, ऐसा होगा, वैसा होगा. Trust me, those things are temporal, if at all they exist. I don't think they exist. Even if they exist, they are temporal. If you want to make a mark, if you want to make a permanent mark in this world while you're having this human existence, there's no alternative to hard work. Work harder than as harder as you can imagine. The harder you work, the fruits have to bear. They take time. They take time, but when they come in such a big manner, and the amount of satisfaction they give you is just unmatched. You all seem to be satisfied.
Sir, I have.
Yes.
So there's this one field where we all need, like we all agree that we need effective implementation of international law. That is the situation of war. So, sir, I want to know your views, like during the time of war, how do you come to consensus, or if you at all engage in?
It's a fairly open-ended question and has several aspects of it.
Yes.
Let me try to respond as many as I have understood and as many as I can conceptualize. Well, let me give you a short crash course in use of force in international law. See, the concept of use of force has transformed drastically over time. If you look at the pre-Christian times, Christianity times, it was anybody could declare war against anybody. But when it was the Holy Roman Empire, everybody was under one domain. The concept was just war. You have to have just reasons for war. But despite the bar of just reason for war, we saw the kind of wars we had. In India, we never had, in this subcontinent, we never had wars. But Europe was really badly burnt during the First and the Second World War. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is really the starting point. That's where they say that we as a nation would not have a national policy of declaring war. So it was an obligation on states not to declare war against anybody. That was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. In which after the Second World War, then the First World War, then the Second World War, the war kept happening. And it was ultimately the UN Charter. And if you look at the UN Charter, the ethos of the UN Charter is to scourge our generations of past wars. The entire emphasis of the UN Charter was to avoid war. And then the only way in which today anybody can declare war is in exercise of right of self-defense, which means somebody has to attack you and then you exercise your right of self-defense. Now today the debate is how far does the exercise of right of self-defense goes. Some American scholars after or post-Afghanistan and post-Iraq started arguing that right of self-defense is in perpetuity. So if you drop one bomb, if you bring in towers, twin towers, I can wait, think, respond, and then use my force, which would be right of self-defense. So these are open issues, we still don't know where it falls. So use of force is still in a sense a very complex issue. It has a very close relationship with political decisions. But today we have outlawed war. One state cannot declare war against any other state. All you can do at best is exercise self-defense, and after exercising self-defense you have to inform the Security Council that I've exercised the self-defense, now you come to my rescue. The architecture of self-defense is centered around collective self-defense through the Security Council. Of course there are various nuances, various sophisticated aspects of use of force. But that's where we stand today. Now the issue is of implementation. Use of force is a big issue, but let's take other areas of implementation of international law. Often there is no strict enforcement mechanism. Let's say there's a judicial decision, there is no strict enforcement mechanism. In international law, to be a good international lawyer, you should be always able to flip the situation and apply it to yourself and see if you will accept it. Like for example, to have strict monitoring a bit of non-absoluteness of enforcement in international law. Because if you introduce absoluteness, there is a possibility of abuse. There is every possibility that a bigger nation will push through things against smaller nations, saying we have a right to enforce and we are going to enforce things against you. But at the same time, international law is not an answer for all questions of international relations. It is one aspect of international relations. There are several other aspects of international relations, and a lot of disputes are resolved at the political level. They need not be brought into the legal field. One of the problems of international lawyers is we tend to think everything from the prism of law. We tend to force our lawyerly understandings on every other aspect of international relations. It may be good to write academic articles, you might expand your purview, but it is going to ultimately disrupt the balance. Everything has a balance. As long as the balance remains, that doesn't mean international law should not be enforced or cannot be enforced. If international law would not have been there, if it would not have been enforceable as such, or states would not have taken it seriously, then all the conspiracy theories about Jadhav would have been true. The fact that he's alive, I remember somebody met me and said, oh, he's already killed by Pakistan. I said, oh, is it? How do you know? No, even Raw knows that. I said, all right. But he seems to be very much alive, which is because of international law. So we have to understand as to how far law can go and how much the law should be pushed. Of course, the law needs to be pushed to meet the demands of the society. By society, I mean the international community. So I think it's a very good phrase, ubi societas ibi jus. International community is our society. In that society we need laws, but how much, to what extent and how, that has to be done reasonably, not with over-enthusiasm and not with negativism or pessimism as well.
Sir, as you said that war has prevailed since very ancient times, right? So with regard to international humanitarian law, so sir, right now what is happening is, what is evil about war is that the helplessness of those people who do not have any vested interest in war. That is what makes the war demonic. So who takes the responsibility of those people?
See, to begin with, the ICRC has done amazing work in humanizing war. It is a demonic activity. Killing anybody for any purpose is a demonic activity. But there are situations when states have to be practical and respond when there's an aggression. But while doing it, it has to be done in the most humanistic manner. And that is what the ICRC rules, the Geneva Conventions, the protocols, that's what they aim at. Yes, in today's world there have been severe violations of humanitarian law in armed conflict. Some people don't even believe in international law, like ISIS, so forget about humanitarian law.
They say it's fiction, international law is fiction.
Yes, for them it's a fiction. But I think it's, as again coming back to my Indian origins and Indian roots, we always had principled wars.
Yes.
The rule in Mahabharata was no fighting at night.
At night.
The reason why Ashwatthama was cursed was because he broke the rules of war. So it was given a religious sanctity. If you don't do, you would be cursed, and this is what, well, I don't say that would work for everybody. All that I'm trying to say that we did have those traditions. Yes, people are trying to push them across. ICRC is working very hard. There's a need of awareness. Armed forces need to be aware of these issues, because a war is between armies, it's not between people.
Between the people. So we see women, when in normal conditions, in normal countries, they are living in such a pathetic condition. So what would happen to them during war? So that question implies like how warfare is affected.
Yes, so we need more international lawyers, we need more good international lawyers, more women international lawyers, and more Indian international lawyers. That's the solution to it.
So what changes you are expected from the new education policy? Because we are not aware about this. Because this is a very popular issue. Because we are not aware about. We are as a law student, we always say that we are a civil lawyer or a criminal lawyer. So how we can make this international law as a popular law between us?
Thank you very much for asking the
Mr.
second.
Rathod, I will add on to what he is saying. I am a teacher in IB University affiliated college and I have taught international law also. The problem is we don't seem to be having enough qualified professors who specialize in international law. So even if a student seems to be willing to make a career in international law, he doesn't either seem to be having the knowledge or the options. So where do you think, what should be done with that aspect?
Because one more thing I have to add it, because the universities are focusing on the duties. Because in the affiliation we are learning the international law by dukis, singles, dukis. So we are limited on that context. So what suggest?
Some time back I spoke about the importance of hard work. I can tell you one thing convincingly, and I said that in a private conversation before coming here, is you will never come across a successful international lawyer who was an average student. Every successful international lawyer across the world has been a topper in his batch in his country. Pick anybody. I think I should prove myself to be one. I was the best student of ILS Law College the year the ILS Law College was ranked first in India. I think that was the only strange year when they decided to rank them first. So, it's just an example. If you're not bright enough, if you're not hardworking enough, international law would never absorb you. The system is such, the system of international law is such, it is a high risk, high stake game. If you're not bright enough, you would never take that risk. And if you are bright enough, then you don't care. So, an international lawyer is never a victim of educational policy. He can't be. When I used to study law, people used to make fun of me. I used to I often make a joke, I feel undereducated. I didn't go to law school, I went to a law college. I'm proud about it, I went to ILS Law College. And when I was doing law, people used to laugh at me. They used to say, why are you reading books? I used to study for 6 months. We had an annual pattern. I used to study for 6 months. I used to buy all the textbooks, read all the textbooks. My parents have still retained them. I used to underline every line that I read, then make notes, read, absorb, go write exam. It's not that every time I got best marks despite my efforts. But my understanding of law was amongst the top in my group because I had taken umpteen efforts. I didn't know about this Duki. There used to be this Jabwala in Maharashtra. And then there used to be some other Pathan notes or something. Which, see, if you just want to pass a law exam, it's your choice. If you want to make a career in international law, it's your choice. So we really can't balance out those two things. In terms of professors, yes, we don't have the culture of international law. We never had. And again, I was explaining it in the private conversation some time back. International law started, the modern international law started in 1649 after the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. So all these European countries, all these European scholars have been studying international law since 1649. For us, international law started in 1947 when India became independent. We became a subject of international law. We were not even a subject of international law until then. Till 60s, 70s or even till 80s, we were still struggling with what is this Eurocentric alien system. It is today that we have come to a stage where we can participate. And we can not just participate, but we can contribute effectively. Yes, the reason why I keep giving my example is it's a small example, it's not a big example. But I give this small example to make a point that India is a country which has people who are far more talented, far more competent than you. And they are the ones who can not just break all these records, these are trivial records for them. They can do much bigger things, much better things that I've been able to do. And I'm confident we can do it. The only thing is, we have to go in that direction. Someone needs to tell us, yes, there is. The scope may not be as much as it is that you might find if you start practicing in court right tomorrow after getting your law degree. There might be waiting period, there might be difficult times, but if you are cut for it, if you are ready to take the academic risk, the risk of hard work, success has to follow.
So just as a matter of fact, that international law is having various fields. For example, commercial international law, corporate international law.
Yeah.
So what are your views on the institutionalization of arbitration? As various arbitration institutes, the foreign institutes, for example, Hong Kong Arbitration Center, MCIA, Nani Palkhiwala Arbitration Center, as some of it are domestic arbitration centers as well. So what is your view with regard to in the coming future?
Yeah.
Will it overlap the normal judiciary, as the judiciary is already overburdened with a large amount of cases?
Yes, although I don't do much of arbitration anymore, but that's what I used to do a lot when I was in regular Supreme Court practice. And I can tell you, I don't think my conclusions have changed over time. They've rather been reaffirmed. Arbitration is bound to be the next big thing. The courts can't afford to have so many cases. But what we lack today is a robust institutional structure. What we lack today are professional arbitrators who can deliver. I can give example of a friend of mine who's young, who's maybe a couple of years older than me. We started practice in the Supreme Court just around the same time, before or later. He was recently appointed as an arbitrator in a small dispute. And he was telling me he finished the proceedings in 3 months. He heard everybody properly. And now he is drafting a very nice award. And I'm very sure it's going to be a fantastic award. So we have talented people. It's just that it takes time for them to, because the past generation has been there, the new generation comes in, the new generation is new ideas, fresh energy. So as the new generation comes in and starts filling in the space, the scope for arbitration is going to increase many-fold times. India is a massive country. You need to talk to a European to understand how important India is. It's not a country, it's a subcontinent, which is true. So what you can do in one arbitral institution can do in one European country is that institution can generate equal business in one state, or maybe 2 of them can generate in one Indian state. Today morning when I was flying from Pune to Delhi, it's a 2-hour flight, I was complaining, so long flights. In Europe, 50 minutes, 55 minutes flights. So it's such a large country. It's a country which is growing economically very fast. It's a country which is getting impatient, which wants dispute resolution quickly. And that's where qualified lawyers who can understand these arbitration issues, get to the issues quickly and resolve those issues quickly, are bound to do well. We're only looking at the big market, but there's a huge market of smaller, mid-size arbitrations and smaller arbitrations that nobody can deny. Good, so we all have a bright future. I think we should end at that note then. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure talking to you.